Okay, so we will start the last part of our program, a panel discussion, which I want to just briefly say that even though some questions might be a little bit informed by your particular talks, there's a very nice English word for that I just forgot. I would implore you to answer, like to answer them, even if it doesn't is tied necessarily to your talk, because I'm eager to hear your perspectives, and we will be a little bit expanding, maybe combining, following up on. And I actually want to start with the mythical third way, which, yes, was a part of 68, but also was present in the time around transformation, be it reformed communism, democratic socialism, as a sort of pushback against the idea during transformation that capitalism has to go hand in hand, or neoliberal capitalism has to go hand in hand with democracy. And this was subsequently crushed by the there is no alternative policy. So I'm interested in if you have any interested takes on this particular legacy of a third way or post-transformation window of opportunity for something different. And if there are any lessons to be learned from that era that would maybe help us overcome the same belief we still have that democracy is still inseparable from the current form of capitalism. And feel free, yeah, sure, please.
I talk that you ask me, I mean, you look at me, so that we go from this side.
Yeah, we can, sure.
I actually, maybe more general, for me the question was why this whole topic is brought for a discussion, no? After practically 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then we had the whole first part of completely, let's say, a censorship. It was no talk about any kind of what was going on in socialism, but actually everything was put in the garbage under this idea of totalitarianism and so on. So that period, now, I always say it was a period of closure, and now we come and find ourselves, for example, here, but maybe in some other setting where it's almost in a certain nostalgic way is a discussion of socialism. And this is for me always the most important question. So what we do, for whom we do, no? And I found in regard to the discussions that are going on that it's some kind of bad fashion, I will call this kind of topics where it's not clear what is their function, for whom we talk, and mostly in the 90s when we had discussion in ex-Yugoslavia where it was, despite everything, quite some interest to think about just what was before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and some of these questions were put in a very critical manner because, as I said before, one important element of the period before what happened with the fall of the Berlin Wall and after was the genocide in Srebrenica. So the question was in 1995, and to recuperate the whole period of the 90s to understand what is that we see, because practically the genocide and then the legacy of what we thought it was so important, not by everybody, but groups and so on, practically went into nullity. Because the genocide showed that our perception, the possibilities was put on a way that we could not imagine that this will be the result. So maybe we could not think clearly also of that period, what kind of processes was going on before the fall of the Berlin Wall. But what was interesting was that important positions, like I mentioned also, Žarana Papić, could, from the feminist legacy, that is really important, could come to the point, for example, to utter something that we see today in the most developed form. And this is what I was talking about, this turbo-fascist nationalism that was the product and also the way of making the rethinking specifically the societies that came out of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But what was the other side? The other side was that mostly the leftists were saying, and we always made a reference, that white kids, young white kids that wanted actually to be progressive, they didn't want to talk about these things. And also the whole tradition was saying, please don't talk to me about post-colonialism, for example, because I remember it was some like Zizek saying, if I hear just the word post-colonialism, I just take a Colt and I kill the person. So my point is that at that time, everybody wanted just the laws to talk about deteriorization. So today, listening this, I thought that was the 90s. And now, practically, when everything is almost defunct, we go back and the white kids wants actually to think about or to get stories about socialism, while in the present world, we have huge and repressive processes of really violent racializations. People are disposed in thousands, and actually this is nobody's business. But if I think it's quite an important thing to think. I always ask myself what I do, where I go when I decided to come, why to come here, why these topics, to whom to talk, no? But regarding the question of democracy that you posed, it's very interesting maybe to think this democracy into the reference, just to expand, no? Democracy, yes, but how to think democracy today. And more is becoming obvious if we make this reference from democracy to necropolitics, that and also what we can learn from theoretical research is that the point of democracy in the first world, let's say, and we are also part of this Occidental world, it's not just simply questions of freedom, but more or less we work with relations of democracy toward violence. And the way how democracy functions is just more or less trying to diminish violence. And this is actually what we have by daily life and also as a kind of a social bond, while freedom is becoming more and more clear that is a category that maybe will be necessary to think precisely in relations to those who has nothing to lose, they have only their lives, and actually they are exposed to really an interminable level of death. So that it's different than violence. We can be under violence, but still we are sitting here talking and having fun, and we think like maybe good or a bad stand-up comedy. We make like stories, but it's not the same as those disposed, those under huge violence of racialization that are also for many in Europe meaning nothing. So in this way, I think the question of democracy and violence is very key, while the question of freedom is actually very much to be connected with those who are in really a peril of death. That means all those heavily racialized and not even taken as humans.
So just a very quick follow-up. Do I understand it correctly then for you as a kind of ethical stance, perhaps, what...
I don't think about political.
Political stance would then be that a much more important or like much more productive and politically important is to be aware of those processes you just described than to talk about post-communist identity.
No, I just want to say that you cannot talk about post-communist identity if you don't have these relations to history in the last 30 years, and if you don't put this in relations to what actually we have as a process today. So this talk, it's not having substance, but can bring a lot of fun. But fun for whom? So this is...
Does anybody wants to? Oh, you look.
You guys are.
Okay, I will then ask more specific questions to that side of the table. But please continue.
Okay, I probably try to catch up with what Marina said. When you mentioned third way, the first picture I saw was a Tony Blair. It was a horror. What a third?
Cool Slovakia.
There is no third. I mean. It's not a topic, no longer topic. Then this week there was a discussion of Yugoslavia as a non-aligned country, which is discussions on non-alignment. Why it is interesting? Interesting is because if you look today at the concrete politics in the for instance, post-Yugoslav space, that everything is about alignment. In Serbia you have the liberal side, which says we should align with the West and not with Russian world. Then you have right wing who would like to align with Russian world, and then you have those who criticize it from the perspective of Islam. Alignment with Islam, which is even left. If you read East, left, East, you will find scholars who analyze, for instance, socialism from using the concept of whiteness. But one of the theses is that former Yugoslavia was a concept created by the West to prevent the spread of Islamic fundamentalism into Europe. So, but generally, my point is that all questions about democracy, about social justice, even about, cultural topics, identity, have been squeezed into this one question. How do you align? With whom do you align? Are you aligning with the West or with something else? This is the concept of the normative identity blocks that have completely occupied the political space. So instead of any sort of discussion, what was the communism? What shall we do? Is this anything we can do about improving democracy or changing or something? You have always now one question to be answered first, with whom you align. And this is the completely new situation. There is no third way.
I would like maybe to just comment also on what you said now. I think that such rhetorical thoughts, from my point of view, they are completely emptying any kind really of debate. So before it was a very interesting debate by one of your colleagues, and I found very valuable what was said because was exposed anti-Romanism, also inside the socialist context very clearly, with quite an important critical tension. What was in the time of socialism, anti-Romaism, that we had many names, and also our ideas that at that point the things were fantastic, that it was integration and so on, while the speaker was very clear that this was our, let's say, it was a myth in a certain way, and that from that many other processes are coming, and today also troubles because of not reflecting onto that anti-Romaism, socialism, we actually repeat brutally in turbo capitalism many of these discrimination. So, in talking about this, and I think you are emphasizing this Muslim aspect, I thought that is very important thesis and research done on anti-Muslim racism. That are also connected with a deeper history of how you got the Srebrenica genocide. Because the Srebrenica genocide didn't happen because people were evil, but there was a whole history in the way how to think about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and specifically the project after the Second World War in relations to Muslim parts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and specifically there this kind of clashes between Serbs, Croats, and then the Bosniaks that was invented and put in this categorization connected with the religion, and then also this was not reflected back with anti-Muslim racism. And anti-Muslim racism today it's really endemic also in ex-Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia, but also in the whole European context. So this was some points of reflection if you want to think seriously.
Thank you for them. It seems like our panel, one of the things that we're dealing with is retelling of history, perhaps, or uncovering the forgotten history or marginalized history. But I would be, and it's purposely broad question, to be interested in what Agnes has to say about history from her point of view, and maybe connected to her talk, because we didn't hear much about history from you yet. Or historical retelling, maybe, to be more specific. Or maybe even like lessons from history and marginalized history that are connected to the topic you talked about.
I would just go back to this third way question.
Okay,
it is part of something we can discuss from within history. I don't want to address these epistemological big questions at the moment. So, but it would explain something on how I look at these things. Also, when I'm looking at history of social movements in Eastern Europe. So if we think of third way as this question, that couldn't we just democratize after 89 instead of going under this neoliberalization, deindustrialization craze and suppression of local working populations, and everything wasn't that way open? So many people spoke about it, right? I mean, this was the third way, but even people who didn't call themselves third way Jesus called themselves civil society or ecological movement or movement of small communities. Basically, this is how they imagined it. In sociological dissident literature, the discovery of poverty within socialism was treated as an argument for transition towards democracy. Socialism, this big mammoth centralized state, is bad because, see, it is producing poverty. In order to help the poor, we need democratic market transition. The idea was that democratic market transition will be good for the poor. And then this is not what happened. And I just want to emphasize some of the perspective of how I think it's worth looking at this. And the main thing in this term, I think, is that these were ideas in the heads of politicized middle-class activists, and they wrote it down. They spoke about it as much as they could publicly. In some places they couldn't, in some places they could. And their voice was very much amplified through this Cold War epistemology that Boris just spoke about in his talk. So, you know, if an intellectual in Eastern Europe said something about social revolution needs, then it was all over the place as something interesting, even though locally it didn't represent anyone, it didn't necessarily represent social power, other than Polish Solidarność. We didn't really have actual movements who could move something in the region behind such civil society intellectual voices. So in this sense, it is overrepresented. You have to look at the structural process in which they were positioned, and you have to, you know, measure the significance of their voice to the process that was going on. And in the process, we know, like, for instance, Hungary was one of those countries deeply super indebted by the moment. We were part of the IMF since 1972. The country signed all the agreements that were in there. Up until 1986, all the most important economic liberalization laws were already passed, including the privatization of banks and everything. So after transition, in a situation when you are deeply indebted and you are in a very strong need of capital, because the socialist state with its capacities is dismantled, you are going to turn towards Western capitalists and do whatever they want, because otherwise you cannot keep your economy functioning. So was there a chance to choose a third way, even if there were different political leaders with different ideas in their heads? Most probably there wasn't. Of course, this doesn't mean that whatever actors couldn't optimize their activity in different directions. Maybe they could, but for the country as a whole, it really doesn't seem like there was a third way given. But and then just two anecdotes on how this happened on the ground. So one of the typical anecdotes that circulates about Hungarian regime change is about the Liberal Party, which in the beginning it was a network of free initiatives, it called itself. So it was this civil movement. And once the network got notified that they turned into a party, but not everybody, but those ones who were these intellectuals who just suddenly turned the initiative into a party without the initiative knowing about it. So this was the liberals, you know, the flagship of democratization. And these same liberals, okay, within their circle of friends who were in the in-group of creating the party, they started writing the program. And there were the good-willing intellectuals, like, from now on, market freedom, civic freedom, it will be good for the poor, for you know, peasant entrepreneurs, everyone. And the other section was the economists who actually knew the numbers. They were trained in these programs that Boris also explained, like Ford Scholarship and everything. They knew Hayek, Mises. So they just told them that, wait, the economic part is not going to be like that. We just write it like this. And those were the neoliberal reforms. And the intellectuals said, well, okay, we don't know about the numbers, so probably you're right. And then, you know, the regime change happens. These people, together with others, it was this peaceful transition with the National Roundtable. So at the National Roundtable, they passed very important pre-constitutional agreements, things like you cannot have general strike, you cannot have political strike, we are not going to include the possibility for workers' property in the privatization, stuff like that. And then we have the regime change, and then you see in the work and the media speeches and the when they write their memories, memoirs of those people who were in the social work on poverty, from these dissidents within the same networks. Like some of them went on and they established the homeless assistance system in Budapest. And they were struggling even until now throughout their whole life to maintain a system that is actually able to provide some sort of proper assistance. And the way they start to write after, I mean, in the second half of the 90s about this, that actually what I'm realizing is that the system I am trying to build is not working, because it is an element of the bigger system that we set up together, and the economic part of it is making our work into this small compensatory mechanism that is never big enough to compensate for the inequality of the housing situation that marketization created. Yeah, there's another anecdote. Shall I say it, or it's too long?
Maybe a little bit later, if that's okay, because I want to quickly follow up with Jodi, actually, with a little like more infrastructural larger question, because we talk a lot about different nationalist sentiments and fascist sentiments, and also like historic sentiments. And one of your most well-known concepts is communicative capitalism. To bring it up a little, so. I was wondering if you'd have something interesting to add from that infrastructural point of view to this circulation of effects tied to these identities, and B, seems like we would need solidarity, which you're also an expert on, from what I understand, maybe a much more transnational solidarity that would bridge those maybe more local sentiments that are happening.
Those are wonderful questions. I'm not sure I'm going to answer them, though. I wanted to follow up, if that's okay, on something Agnes was saying.
Of course.
And we can maybe come back to the other ones if you don't mind. But it does have to do with the larger kind of global structures. And there's a wonderful book I'd like to recommend called Globalists by Quinn Slobodian. He's an American historian. And one of the interesting things in this book is how he talks about the formation of just the infrastructure that becomes part of the IMF and the World Bank, and the sets of treaties, the trade agreements, and the theory that went into building that. And he associates it with some, I guess, German or Austrian scholars he calls the Geneva School. You know, they're not Swiss, but even though he locates them there. And one of the things that they were, and then their ideas catch on. But what matters here is they were really mostly worried about third world liberation struggles. And they were worried about third world liberation struggles because they thought they were going to introduce too much chaos into the system. And so they were against all, anti-colonialism. And one of the things that they do then is try to figure out, how can you have a global trade network, a set of global trade arrangements that are going to bind people? And what they figure out is these debt arrangements, and that really it's okay. It doesn't matter who's in charge of a country, right? What matters are the agreements that tie them into a global trade system. So I think that that's one of the things that I have appreciated in so much about Agnes's intervention is thinking about these, and it made me think of that. I mean, now we have relatedly we have the kind of stupid world of mass personalized media that now this is the communicative capitalism part that tells us that what matters most is our every individual feeling and reaction to absolutely everything. And those conditions undermine possibilities of solidarity and increase likelihoods for the circulation of individualism and outrage. So it's another layer that actually makes building the alliances we need, the unity we need, so much harder.
Any hope?
Oh, sure, there's always hope. There's always hope in the people, always hope in organized struggle, for sure.
Yeah, because maybe the question also is, like, how do we, and Frederick Jameson uses the cognitive mapping metaphor, or maybe it's not a metaphor, but cognitive mapping term, because how to even intervene in those systems from here, from Bratislava, from this table, from our specific point of view. I mean, maybe it's a question to all of you. How do you orient your own practice, like in the face of such overwhelming infrastructural odds?
Even though I was just talking, I'll talk a little. We were Agnes and I were talking about this earlier, and how to do.
Great, you prepared.
How to? I don't know about that, but I mean, honestly, a lot of my thinking about these things came in reaction to the tech and new media conversation in the 90s, that whenever there was a problem, it's like, oh, well, there's a technological fix, and build a website or have indie media, and everything was going to be solved by media. And so Soros would fund media centers, and that was going to enhance democracy, and all the tech and all the democracy were going to solve the problems. And that's actually not true. There's not a shortcut. And so in my own personal practice, it's like, be a member of a revolutionary party and do the organizing work in the I'm not kidding, it's actually true. Right. And do the organizing work day to day, because the thing that is likely is some kind of revolution. You don't know when, and also what you don't know is how it's going to turn out. So you have to prepare.
So basically we should still believe in the power to convince other people and find language to talk to them, which I guess we are quite often failing, not you specifically, but us as intellectuals.
Maybe I then jump in. I think it's not only about convincing; it's about also a systematic kind of a process, no? Because if I think. You ask what we do, what kind of how we organize our work. I practically always thought that the organization of proper work is actually connected, of course, with this idea of how to see the relations between class, gender, but also race inside the processes of our, let's say, societies in which we live, and what also, if we just can think of these things that they are just one near the other, or actually the neoliberal global capitalism that I really think we have to redefine as necro-capitalism because of these new implications in which way death is used as really a product, a place to produce capital, how we can see that these lines of class, gender and race are not just in parallel, but actually we live in a moment of history, or maybe even already a past, in where looking structurally, one of these elements is actually superimposed. And the point of neoliberal global capitalism, specifically necro-capitalism, is that race that is really difficult, it's big difficulties to pose processes of racialization in the European context as a central methodology. How practically the divisions that we see or we don't want to see are really circulating along what I was also talking about race, the colonial divide and processes of racializations. And this element in the way of thinking and also working is very important for the organization of my practice.
I was also asking just because I know that I will tomorrow arrive to Prague, and I see some news, and I will be again reminded of the fact that there is no leftist representation in the parliament whatsoever, and a member of a government party was just being subtweeted by her minister for attending a socialist conference. So that's also maybe an emotional level of what I was asking, as to even keeping on despite the fact that for some reason the anti-capitalist or anti-neoliberal sentiments just didn't reach those who are most affected by it.
So what is, let's say, your also work, your practice in this way? You are disappointed, you come there, you don't see this, but what is actually I will say, the ground of the work that you do? No, it doesn't, not only here, but what is your agenda? I think this is also very key, because we can be disappointed, but on the other part is also what we do in our practice or our study areas or in our, let's say, academic and university life. Are we just declamating and throwing words, or we are actually also contextualizing the conditions, the positions from where we are coming? I think this is a key. To whom we talk about socialism, what kind of socialism? Is this a telenovela because we don't have nothing to do, but we want fun to come home, like it was psychoanalysis for long in Slovenia, and it's practically left an imprint, a very hard imprint, because you have no other topics. And so you are middle class, you come home, like you have a nice furniture, you also want to have a story telling about Lacan. This is not, I think, no an agenda. So the same is the questions that you pose. Being nostalgic, I don't think it's the right way. It's also connected what we do, what we talk, what we want, what is to what we point our fingers, or we just want, as I said, stand-up comedy on topic. If you ask yourself what is the problem in the context of Slovakia, or I completely agree with that colleague that was before here talking very clearly about really deep marginalization, and the Roma minorities, if we just don't want to talk about the others from the other parts, are practically in a positions throughout Europe, everywhere, even in Kosovo, completely marginalized, violently put outside any discourse. And this is going on, for example, in Slovenia daily. So when you talk, you have to put these things also part of the discussion. You cannot just talk about, as I said, the laws, or behave like a Žižek and even look like a Žižek. This is one of our other symptoms that we have, as a space. So it's really a question where we want to go, or we just do fun.
Thank you. But Boris was holding a microphone, or was it? Or you're holding too?
Yeah, but you wanted to.
Yeah, maybe go ahead, and then we'll circle back to Boris.
Okay.
If that's okay with you.
Okay, so about what to do, is it still possible? So on the one hand, I think analysis clearly tells us that there is this problem that the capacities to change something are at a very low and incipient level, while the crisis is at a very high and fast level. And it's just, promising people that don't give up hope, you'll do it, it'll be fine, just try the revolution and it will surely succeed, would be lying analytically. So, if you're a grown-up today, then you have to optimize your activity compared to what you can know as a grown-up. And the way I approach this question is that as long as, we still have relatively functioning civilizational infrastructures around us. I mean, I didn't work the whole day to get clean water because I already had it today. We don't know about 5 years or 10 years' time. So today I can dedicate my work to try to build something, and then it becomes this question of optimization, to always aim for the right angle and use all our present power to build the next level. And this why I was emphasizing infrastructural scale in the talk was that I think that's one of the prerogatives of this optimization, that we need to raise the infrastructural capacity of building social power in order to have a capacity to change the direction of the processes as high as possible on the infrastructural scale. And then something about this, what you can do as an intellectual, what are we doing here speaking about things? I think it's also important to put our position into this analytical frame. So now we are in a moment, ever since 2008 at least, when middle class also feels the crisis and middle class thinking turns towards critical thought yet again. But this doesn't mean that what happens in middle class thought necessarily represents everything that is possible or necessary in the broader objective reality of the system. And this is why originally materialist analysis was discovered or worked out for, so that you are able to think about the objective system in other ways too than just your own phenomenological feelings from your position. And in these terms, some of the important reminders that I always say, but also remind myself of, is that you need to correct some of the middle class political reflexes when thinking about what to do. One of the reflexes is that you're an expert of something, so when your thinking turns towards criticism, then you start to produce expert knowledge that is critical about something, like critical psychology, critical sociology, critical analysis of this, analysis of that, and then you start doing the expert criticism as your middle class lifestyle. That might not be as efficient in terms of turning something over. And the other reflex is to go towards representation, because the idea is, especially here in Eastern Europe, because of our given historical trajectory and the role of middle classes in that we think that we represent the development of our country. When I feel that there is a crisis, because finally the crisis reached my position too, then I suddenly start thinking about, okay, what to do about the country? I will start a political party, I will write some program for it, and then I will represent the poor workers. That might also not work because it also integrates into existing structures of bourgeois politics and representation. And we see all the examples, not only here in Eastern Europe, also in Europe or the US, that what post-2008 movements did in terms of building representative politics didn't manage to build the actual social power that those parties or party fractions that even made it into politics could actually do their projects. I mean, the Syriza case is one of the big examples, but we could speak about all the rest. So I think what is really important is to do the analysis of what is happening around us and to try to engage into actually organizing social power there where we are. So like being part of a union would be one easy step because we are already working somewhere, but you can also direct it towards more tactical, falsy, like not only do union in the theater, but also do union organizing in industries and then try to build this cross-sectoral action.
Thank you. I have a follow-up on that, but Boris, you first.
I can a bit comment and continue what was raised as a problems. What you mentioned, the problem of the system of the parliamentary democracy. It is obvious that electorates, not only parliaments, have no power and ability to cope with the crisis. We all know that every 4 years, we have the right to vote, and we do vote, and we choose some parties, but every 4 years we sit helplessly and watch, swinging states in the United States, whether these thousands of voters will for this or another option, and we know that this will decide the fate of millions, for instance, in Ukraine, in Europe, in the world. And then Nobody asks, where is the equality, within this democracy? And one said, the West is, democracies, Western democracies. Mechanical sum of democracies is not a democracy. So, to put it short, in the post-national spaces of sovereignty, within these normative identity blocks, there is no more democracy and there is no more equality. And these electorates are not able to deal with these problems. This is our small, Slovakia, Slovenia, Slavonia. Americans usually mix, Slovakia, Slovenia, Slavonia, and etc. Anyway, this is one thing. And another thing is, the West being a role model for all. This is very simple to answer, especially, it's still in the South. We want to be like Germany, stable, normal, functioning, democracy, middle class. If in the whole world people would consume energy as an average German, the whole energy of the world would be consumed within one day. So it cannot be the role model. There must be something else. But who will remind us of the necessity to think radically again? Not we. We are corrupt middle class. But you mentioned there are these processes of migration, and capitalism cannot function without it, but cannot solve the problem. And add the global warming, and add the next wave. What has been experienced from 2015 until nowadays is, the beginning. But when global warming, and mentioning civilizational infrastructure, drinking clean water, when hundreds of millions won't be able to drink clean water, then the problem will be at the doors. This is the problem is now that it looks that elite find a solution to the problem that they cannot cope with the crisis in war, and that war might be not a problem but a solution instead. And this can remind us on the First World War, if you like. But just imagine someone somewhere in Slovakia, in I don't know, Croatia, or some voter thinking, shall I be next year in war with China? This is absurd. But they have to live with this. So I think we will be soon reminded about the necessity of some radical solutions, and the fortress Europe and the whole concept of building walls, etc., and militarization of this of the union created to prevent the war. Now, waging war. What we all have been doing. I can tell stories about 90s war in former Yugoslavia, activism, anti-war, media, Western foundations, regime change, all these stories, but obviously classical forms of representative democracy, parliaments are themselves in a deep crisis. They are, as Peter Mayer would say, emptied. They are emptied of any ability to deal with these problems. And this is actually the moment of crisis.
Do you want to comment on that, or?
No, I agree with that. I mean, we don't, given the structure of global capitalism and the pressing problems of climate change, there's not a space where democracy, for democracy to even operate. right? It can't, there's no sovereign countries anymore. Sovereignty is fragmented, parcellated into zones. Every country has limits on what it can do. And yet we also have these situations of climate change that require something much bigger than any specific country or any specific industry or any specific, anything specific is the wrong thing. And so it's like, where's the proper, what is the political form adequate to the crisis that we're in? And honestly, I think, coming from the US, in popular language, people talk about being on the edge of civil war. It's not an exaggeration. It's the question is just it's most likely to be how and when, and that also then means that the hegemony that the U.S. has exercised over the last 30 or 40 years is also really clearly crumbling. The changes in how do you say it? The way that the diminution in the power of the dollar, the fact that more global trade is now happening in other currencies beside the dollar, that's also really important for part of the changes that are happening. But I think that the U.S. is a horribly awful and dangerous, declining hegemon, and that's a huge possibility for more and more destabilization.
I will just add precisely what I was talking in the very beginning, that today this concept of democracy is paradoxical because it's actually, we were always connected with these big notions of freedom, but actually we have only the relations to violence. And that kind of diminishing violence, enormous proportion, this is actually what is going in relations to democracy. Democracy and violence, but not freedom and democracy. Freedom is outside of this, especially what we have today. Freedom is actually for really those that we even don't think that they have the prerogative to be humans, because they are completely dehumanized by the system of democracy that we have, let's say, in the European American context.
And with that, a little bit dire note, I would ask if there's anybody who has anything to add to discussion from the audience. Please, we would have to give you a microphone, so just, I guess, raise your hand or maybe come here. Is there anybody, or should I keep asking for a little bit more?
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the roundtable and for all the talks. So coming back to the question of memory politics, I still feel like on the topic of anti-communism, that was very much at the center of some of the debates. I wonder, to what extent there is indeed actually a experientially sound component to anti-communism beyond this sort of pure ideological use that, of course, the most fervent anti-communists are the 80s managers of communists or the economists who work at the institutes. But I mean, at the same time, there are actually people who have kind of been persecuted, who have in fact suffered under that regime, and from their position, it seems like something that is, well, at least understandable, to have a radical stance in perhaps a mirror. It is a kind of a mirror relation to people who are anti-capitalist because they feel that they suffer the injustices of the regime, perhaps. So I was wondering how to square that, if at all.
Is there anybody concrete you would like to direct the question to? Is there anybody specific? Or maybe Boris just disagrees.
Looks a question, Boris, to me. I will give first a very philosophical answer, but I know what is this. There are people who were really, victims of terror, and they have full right to hate communism, to be anti-communism in their second, third, and so generations. The problem is not so much the real, violence, terror, etc. The problem is how it is presented. The problem of anti-communism is its forensics. I say forensical view into the past. And it is Aristotelian, who divides rhetorics. Forensic rhetorics is rhetorics that deals with the past, that deals with the question of true and lie in the past. But for Aristotle, it's judicial rhetorics. It's rhetorics of a court where there is, clear differentiation between victim and perpetrator. So anti-communism looks into the past from a position of, jury, and that is, here is the victim, here is the perpetrator, and this is the history as a simple relation between perpetrator and victim. Cannot think of victims becoming perpetrators, of any sort of dialectical, historical twist, of any sort of history that changes, that gets us out of the courtroom, or to Aristotelian political rhetorics, which deals with our actions turned to the future. So that, the obsession with memory, with commemoration, that you fight politically through the concept of memory politics. Why not something else? Something like climate change, this is where I see the problems. Of course, people. The problem is, yes, they suffered. Why they will they suffer still? Why they will suffer tomorrow? This is not, unfortunately, the last suffering under totalitarianism, fascism, and etc.
Maybe I just wanted to comment. I found very important your question, by the way, because it's posed in the right space of differences. If we just go historically, differences between what was called this former Eastern European context, and it's a serious question, because exist very different histories behind. But I think outside of this cultural redefinition and rhetorics, that it's necessary to pose maybe one question, and this will be why it's a need to talk about communism in general, if we really come to back. And I think the answer is actually in the, it's not even a decision, it's actually to think only in reference of the question of communism to capitalism. So to the capitalist way or mode of reproduction. So capitalist mode of reproduction that is not, has these elements of private property and has a constant contact exploitation, has also a very deep history, because we can see with neoliberal global capitalism, though it's always the core the same, but the references, the forms are they change. They change. I mean, also in these relations between death and life, the questions of labor, all these categories we didn't even touch, but they are key. So the answer to this question that really affected people, and we have these films and histories, it's only possible to be answered if we make this parallel to capitalism, and if you ask yourself if our future is capitalism, because communism was not just idea, it was actually the possibility to think justice and to think another possibility also in the mode of reproduction. That is key. In the mode of reproduction, how capitalism functions. So the answer can be only really in relations to capitalism. Personally, I think, if I can say personally, that capitalism doesn't matter in a way how it reproduces, how it hides, how it actually produce a total chaos that we have today. And then we think it was a capitalism that was actually the right one. Now we have a stadium. No, these are the consequences, and it will go even worse. Cannot provide by no means, although there exist these myths. In the 70s, it was possible to have a welfare state. Capitalism had relations to labor and so on, cannot provide any kind of justice, can only function through a deepening of exploitation. The exploitation is key. So always will be this system of impossibility to have any kind of a justice society and any kind of prosperity. This will be my, let's say, philosophical answer.
Jodi?
Yeah, just a short response. I think it's absolutely crucial to think in terms of communism as an emancipatory egalitarian horizon, and that's kind of one. The other thing is, I think that it's crucial to also recognize how anti-communism has been a primary justification for U.S. militarism and imperialism. I mean, all over the world. And that can sometimes get lost about the fact of, ongoing wars, U.S. interventions in Latin America, or ongoing sanctions against Cuba, which make no sense. The other, the wars in Vietnam and Korea that the U.S. wages in the name of anti-communism. So that's not nothing.
I would maybe add a little quick question, because the anti-communism kind of sprungs up despite the fact that nobody said communism. For example, when you mention degrowth, like you will get people calling the people talking about degrowth in the relationship to climate change, which if you read the IPCC report, it does argue for something that sounds like degrowth. You will get people talking about communism. So yeah, maybe if is something interesting there or not. Sure.
The book I was showing y'all when we were having coffee, Marx and the Anthropocene by Kohei Sato, he's arguing for degrowth communism. And it's really interesting. And he works on the mega project, the Marx Engels Gesamtarbeit, and is basically has a read of capital, as the unfinished capital, that has a lot to do with Marx's notion of metabolism, and how the repercussions really are that a society of the associated producers would pretty much end up having to be degrowth, in part because of the way that capitalist forms of management and supervision would not be ones that the associated producers would want. And now I'm going to add in my thing, but I think also because it just takes so much time, right, to work with everybody to plan stuff, you're not going to have the kind of ridiculous overproduction of commodities, because we wouldn't have time. We wouldn't want to waste our time with that stuff. We'd have to then spend our time planning things that we thought would be good for our communities and good for other communities, and and good in a global sense, rather than letting the kind of automation of the system run behind our backs. So he hints at that, but it's a smarter analysis rather than this intuitive one.
Yeah, we should throw some seed bombs afterwards. You wanted to respond quickly, or just really quickly, please?
Just to remind you that when we say communism, I don't know what do we mean. What about anarchism? There are so many elements we are talking about. It. Just 50 Central Committee of former Yugoslavia, they're split with Stalin. They explicitly say that the Soviet system is a form of monopoly state capitalism that is worse than the Western one. They say this, but they don't have solution. And then they start to read, Paris Commune, to develop something they call self-management and de-etatization. So the democracy in former Yugoslavia starts as etatization, because you don't have state property in socialism, except the barracks of the People's Army. No factory, no hotel, nothing is state property. So that the first decision of the parliament is etatization. So the democracy starts precisely as though. So I just want to say it is very complicated, it is very complex, and it is anti-communism is a machine of forgetting. You know, forgetting, for instance, anarchist legacies, all sort of connecting anti-colonialism, non-alignment, so many, or active politics of peace. You know, anti-militarism. There are so many elements we implicitly more, address when we today face anti-communism, which anti-communism actually erases the complexity of historical experience.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Okay, there's one. Somebody should have the microphone.
Hi, thank you too for all the talks and the panel. The concept of semi-periphery was mentioned, and I'm curious, while it's useful in many ways for the position of Central and Eastern Europe, there are more countries to fit into this framework, and while some of them fit into the dichotomy of global North and global South, it seems that this part of Europe is sort of a way of the debate about political solutions of climate change and so on. So I'm curious whether you would find a sort of concept of global East useful or not, and where would it lead, possibly? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a bit similar to what Boris was mentioning about area studies being a US perspective, US imperial perspective. So global North, global South is a global North perspective. And global East is also a global North perspective, because compared to them, it's about the Cold War or ex-Cold War. If I try to look at it in terms of how the global economy is organized, then we are semi-periphery, just like Latin America or, Indonesia. So in that sense, if you look at what is happening in Eastern Europe or what is happening in Central Asia today within the dynamics of the green transition, is the same. It is relatively higher, so we are not necessarily, maybe Serbia is, but we are not necessarily the site of energy forests or lithium mines, but we are the site of assembly factories, toxic dumps. Nobody cares about whether the city will get the energy. The main thing is that the factory gets the energy. And we won't have money to pay for the electric cars. We are just producing it type of situation, which is completely common across this position over the globe. And it's also informative in terms of organizing, because, I mean, for instance, Serbian comrades who were organizing against the Rio Tinto lithium mine, they organized a global meeting of newly established lithium site resistant movements in Serbia, because those are the ones with whom they have to exchange information with.
I hear. Sorry, please.
I also thought that maybe it's also interesting to think about the recursive elements of these divisions, because practically today, when you talk about the Fortress Europe, but this European Union, you don't think almost the question of former East and the West is not anymore an agenda. on the opposite, when the former East was ousted, because it was needed to enlarge the European Union, it was a whole process called former West that was launched by the Germany. And that was really a paradoxical thing, because philosophically looking, the Occident, the one, cannot be former. Everybody else can be a former, but not the Occident. So former East, former West, and now looking this circularity, because also structurally speaking, the tautology and the circularity are central to capitalism in the way how it reproduces, also on the ideological level and on the level of, let's say, the infrastructure. So today we have back something that was almost seen as vanished, looking also from the perspective of global world. You have the Orient and Occident literally at your doorstep. No? What, again, I was talking and making a reference to Napriek, one of the theoreticians that I mentioned. You have there a situation practically of hyper-racialized labor that is going on really along this line of Orient and Occident, and we see in the way how we treat, how we talk, how we behave. As I said, Ukraine, refugees, you have the right refugees and you have the wrong. And what is the line? It's not just a cultural feeling. The line is precisely the colonial divide. The Orient-Occident coming back, but not as a whole territory, but actually onto the selection and racialized counting of very specific bodies. So it's very systematic and very structural. All these processes, they are not cultural. But we transform them and then we rhetorize them and use them as some kind of notions that we put around. But we have to go back again to this idea how capitalism actually functions, that many theoreticians very, let's say, on the spot came and actually shown some of these elements, especially global capitalism, tautological, repetitive, and so on.
A quick question, Jodi. If we heard about semi-periphery spanning the globe and us being in a similar subordinate position as perhaps Latin America, do you hear the word internationalism too?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was a leading question. It was a leading question, I admit.
Yes.
Say something to that later. Yeah, so actually whenever I speak you should hear internationalism, but it's not about semi-periphery banding up with the rest of semi-periphery and just trying but it's about all of us. But what I just wanted to add is that yes, so there are all these area reifications and reifications of loyalties that were built up during the Cold War period and then the post-Cold War neoliberal era. Okay, but today we are in another Cold War and we don't know how long it will stay cold, which is really defining what is happening to everybody and to all the systems that define our lives. And within that, we count as a third place for which it is really destructive that we are forced to decouple because we are dependent towards each direction. And in this, we are not alone, but this is the majority of the globe. Like 80% of people on the globe live in these third places. And I think when you're reading the news, it really makes sense to read about them because then you recognize the dynamics that are happening to us. And then it doesn't only appear in your mind as something that has to do with local choices or the specific political sides that are representing those choices locally. And I just wanted to recommend one of the platforms. There are many new platforms now that are trying to follow this, but one of them is explicitly about this. It's called Second Cold War Observatory, and it's really enjoyable to read as an Eastern European.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, if there's one. Okay, if not, you will have a last chance during my last survey question. So it's just a very quick answers. It's more of a fun closing question. What was the last anti or capitalist or a capitalism critical thing that made you happy? Yeah, or capitalism critical thing that made you happy. Who wants to start? Well, you left the most.
I would need some time.
Okay. Or like not. Okay, it doesn't have to be the
Actually,
last.
for me, it's quite I don't know strange question. But let's say that we need something to go to sleep and laugh.
Yes,
but
exactly.
for me, it was very interesting actually when Trump happened as a phenomena. I was saying it came to my mind. I said, okay, actually the history is repeating, and now we see precisely there brutally. It made me not laugh, but actually there was presenting what could not be to expect, as also other stuff that came after Trump. And I said, okay, let's see where these things will lead. What will happen? No, is this dying imperial structure really falling apart and will take us with this, or we will see some possible changes? So.
It came to my mind.
Okay, go.
It was a few weeks ago in Zagreb, in Croatia. Nepal workers from Nepal, from subcontinent, they are extremely exploited. And for the first time, they started to organize union in the spaces of former anti-fascist partisan. So you had connection between former, old, someday in their late 80s, and Nepal workers to come together with some, of course, left to try to organize, to do something against, to organize a union. And it was a nice picture, and it was a moment of hope. It was a moment of hope.
Yeah. Thank you both. Do you have yours?
I do lots of minute organizing, so I have these things every day, but they are so small that I think compared to what we were speaking about, it is hard to make you happy with it. So I will just tell you another example that was in the similar line, but slightly bigger, that when you had these French strike waves around the pension reform, then the energy workers, they were also striking, but they didn't only strike. They were deliberately, while striking, it was part of the strike that they gave free electricity to hospitals, schools, kindergartens. And for those apartment blocks where the people are poor, so they put these special meters because they meter the electricity by the hour. They just took off all the meters.
Thank you.
I will go to the everyday life, small things, because when I look at the big picture, it looks kind of grim. But the small things like recruiting over the last year 10 new people to my branch of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and then seeing in Rochester, New York, which is about an hour from where I live, now they've got enough people to start acting as a unit, and they hadn't acted together before. And then we had a group out at the nurses' strike, then they were able to spread more news about that, and then the nurses followed us again, and so we made those contacts, and that was just one day. And so the small things of seeing like, oh, actually when you do the face-to-face organizing, you can actually organize and people can gain into capacity, that actually kind of helps make the bigger stuff bearable.
Thank you. Hope at last. And I hope for you today has been I don't know if precisely happy, but at least interesting, enlightening, that you take something away with you. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, our honored guests. Thank you, all the supporting staff. And I hope it's not condescending. Thank you all who helped us to make this happen. And yeah, have a good rest of the night. We will be continuing downstairs with the DJ set. I forgot the time, Ivana. It's already playing, so you should go there to the basement. There are drinks as well. So see you there, and thank you so much. And please, last applause for our roundtable.